Hello, everybody. Our topic is Introduction to Administrative Law. That's what lawyers call the whole body of law that tells regulators in government how they're supposed to do their jobs. Our focus here is not so much on what the regulations say. Instead, we're looking at how the regulations get formed. This presentation is the first installment in a series. Here we go. I'm asking you to complete a combination of activities. Read some primary source documents, review this series of recorded commentaries, and discuss the materials together. As a package, these activities are designed to achieve the learning objectives that are listed on this page. So first of all, I'm interested in you just becoming familiar with certain parts of the world. I want you to understand the institutions where regulators work, and I want you to think a little bit like an economist or maybe a sociologist and think about the incentives that are at work on the folks who are doing the regulation. And along the way, I want you to think about the process rules. What is the administrative law structure that will tell us a little bit about what government regulators are going to do? So that kind of familiarity will be the primary objective. Carrying that forward, what I hope you can do with that familiarity is sort the big things from the little things. As you're going through your professional life, you need to know, when I read this story in the newspaper, is this one of the more significant things that I'm going to see from government, or is this just a passing fancy and I don't need to worry or invest as much in this one? It's also true that you often only hear part of the story as you're reading the newspaper or just seeing the world go by. And what I hope is that this activity, this collection of integrated activities, will help you fill in the gaps for stories about government. When you understand an agency name or hear just a snippet about what they're up to, you may be able to fill in some of the background details for yourself and place it in context. So those are my learning objectives for you. I asked you to read primary sources rather than secondary sources. Notice that a lot of professional life pushes you toward reading more primary sources rather than secondary sources. So my background commentary here is going to start by discussing the forest where these trees are located. I've given you several trees. I hope this commentary helps locate them in the forest. When we get together for our discussion, that's going to focus in more detail on the documents themselves. So I'm going to organize my commentary in this series of presentations around three questions. Where are the regulators? Who are they? And what do they do? So with that framing device in place, let's jump into that where question. So where are the regulators? I don't mean in the Google map sense of physically where can you find them on planet Earth. What I mean is their organizational location. In which institutions do regulators work? And how do those institutions where they're located shape the work of the regulators? Now, when lawyers in the US try to answer questions about institutions, they divide the world up into three branches, and you've heard this from civics class over the years, no doubt. So we have what we call a separation of powers system. We think of it graphically as government power being divided vertically into different columns. And so we have the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch. So within this three-branch system, where do you tend to find regulators? Well, first of all, emphatically, you don't find them in the judicial branch. The judiciary is remarkably non-bureaucratized. It's judges with very small support staffs. There are a few exceptions to that at the federal level. One of my favorite agencies is the U.S. Sentencing Commission, a great interest of mine. And that's an agency that creates the rules that judges have to follow when imposing sentences after a criminal conviction. But that's the exception rather than the rule. Mostly the judicial branch is non-bureaucratized, and they just don't have meaningful numbers of regulators working there. It's interesting that not that many regulators are actually working in the legislative branch. So we have a few support offices. We have something called the General Accountability or the Government Accountability Office. It used to be called the General Accounting Office, but now it's the Government Accountability Office. This is a place where any member of Congress can turn and say, would you please study the operation of this governmental agency and tell me what it's doing well and not doing so well? So it's a kind of backward-looking evaluation of Congress's past handiwork. You know, given all the statutes and agencies that we've created in the past, how are they working? And then there's also the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, that is more of a forward-looking office that says, given the government entities that we've created and that are out there running, what are they going to cost? And if we propose some new change to the law, CBO, could you please estimate for us how much that will cost? More changes and more offices for Congress, but so process of elimination. It's not in the judicial branch. It's not in the legislative branch. Of course, most of the regulators are in the executive branch. So that's where we'll focus in now, and we'll use the federal government as the first example. But then later we'll also talk about state governments. So let's drill down and look in a little bit more detail within the executive branch in the federal government for the institutional location of regulators. Now, where are they within the executive branch? I'm not going to walk you through an organizational chart of the federal government. No way could it fit on the single slide here. But I am going to give you some vocabulary clues. So if something is called a department, that's probably a fairly high level of organization. Those are some of the bigger chunks of government, the departments. Now, some of those departments are designated as cabinet-level entities, and I think there are 15 or 16 of them. There's agriculture, commerce, defense, education, energy, health and human services. That's a huge one. Homeland Security has become a huge one. Housing and urban development. Interior, they run all the major land holdings of the government. Labor, State Department handling our foreign affairs, transportation, all the highways and so forth, Treasury, Veterans Affairs. There are a couple of exceptions to this labeling convention. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Administration, is not called a department, but it is the 800-pound gorilla of federal bureaucracies. It's among the most important, probably the most important of the federal agencies. In the end, it doesn't matter that much whether a department is called a cabinet or not, and there's not a strict logic to the naming conventions, but I can tell you that if something's called a department, it's probably one of the bigger chunks of there and gets a good bit. Now, there are also some government entities that provide analysis across departmental subject matter areas. And these I call the White House support functions of government. And they cut across different subject matter areas, but they provide functional support for the White House. Among the most important offices here would be the Office of Management and Budget. The name suggests accurately that they're mostly the money people, although they also help budget in terms of regulatory impact. So there's an especially important subunit of OMB called OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And they're the folks who have the final say-so over some major regulations coming from all the different departments. So OMB and its subunit OIRA are an important set of advisors to the White House that are a centralizing force across government to make sure that policy is reasonably consistent and prioritized across the different subject matter areas of government. Some other examples here might include the Council of Economic Advisors or the Domestic Policy Council. Now, the White House support entities, those offices and agencies that are connected with the Executive Office of the President, they tend to look at the world a bit differently than the departments do. They tend to approach their work, the White House support agencies tend to approach their work with an eye on the budget, or they keep an eye on the interaction among regulatory areas. Whereas the departments, they tend to get tunnel vision. If you're at the Department of Transportation, guess what you think about? You think about highways. You're not really thinking about the remote ripple effects of highways. So there's a bit of a dialogue, a back and forth dynamic between the White House-centered entities and the subject matter entities like the Department of Transportation or the Department of Health and Human Services and so forth. And finally, another vocabulary tip here is that if some chunk of government is called an agency or a bureau or an administration or an office or a center, something along those lines, they tend to be subunits of the larger departments. Again, there's not a strict rhyme or reason to this, but by and large, these words signal some subunit. Now, why do you care if it's a subunit? Well, because politically, the people in the subunits answer up the chain to the appointees and the leadership in the larger department. So a change at the very top of a department might signal a change of priorities or approach in all the units around government. It also tends to signal the long-term historical priorities of that agency. So for instance, some of the food inspection agencies are located in the Department of Agriculture. And so they tend, historically not to have so much of a consumer orientation to these questions. Instead, they're asking, how can we create a viable market for farmers? So, the location of a subunit of government within a particular department will tell you something about its history and its incentives and current priorities. But the key idea here is the vocabulary clue that you get from something being called an office or an agency and so forth. Now, we have zoomed in from government as a whole to the executive branch and from the executive branch to the departments. Now we're going to zoom in from the departments to its subunits. And this is where organizational charts become quite critical. If you look at the websites for any of the major federal departments, they will be littered with organizational charts. And lawyers and other people who deal regularly with these agencies become quite familiar with the organizational charts. You end up knowing how many people are working in different units, who do they answer to, what are the dotted lines of responsibility and the straight lines of responsibility. What are their phone numbers? You just need to know where they're located within the organizational structure for all the reasons that people normally study bureaucracies. It's awfully hard to generalize about these organizational charts, but I'll give you this one observation. The units might be topical. We call them topical units. For instance, here in this organizational chart for the Department of Agriculture, we've got the Undersecretary for Food Safety. That's just a regulatory area, and the folks under this, within this box, there's a bunch of them. The people working in this box are all working on food safety questions. All of them answering to the Undersecretary for Food Safety, and then the Undersecretary for Food Safety goes up the chain and ultimately answers to the Secretary of Agriculture. In addition to these topical areas, there are also functional areas. So There's one other rule of thumb I can give you in looking at organizational charts for larger chunks of government like a department, and that is geographic location. Now, I started off by telling you I wasn't that interested in the Google Maps sense of where can you find a person, but here's an exception. There are certain chunks of government where some of their operations are out in the field. That's the lingo of the area. They're out in the field. For instance, the Forest Service. Obviously you have to put people on the ground in the U.S. Parks and forests, and once you know that a unit of government is not in Washington, not physically close to the political leadership of the organization, that's a clue for you. That tells you that those dispersed offices are probably going to be putting a heavier weight on expertise and on information from the field, interaction with people who are actually affected by the government activity, or people who are close to where the research or information gathering is happening. One example is that the EPA has a big research presence in the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. So the emphasis there is not so much on policy coordination with other units of government. It's about coordination with the scientific community. Now, we have been talking so far about units of the federal government, but there are also major governmental functions that happen at the state level, and lots of those are not under federal control. There are a lot of areas of governmental activity that are specifically set aside for the states. Now, historically, the influence of the federal government has grown over time, and the state government influence has, as a relative matter, shrunken somewhat, but still, some of the most important things that government does that affect our lives daily happen at the state level, and some of them at the local level. The same tripartite separation of powers idea operates at the state level. So, vertically speaking, government is divided into legislative branch and the executive branch and the judicial branch at the state level and the local level, just as it is at the federal level. That being said, now we're also dividing power between the federal level on the one hand and the state and local level on the other hand. This is a doctrine sometimes known as federalism. Notice all this dividing going on. This is part of a design of American government meant to disperse power among lots of different power centers to avoid tyranny. So, in state government, just as at the federal level, the regulators tend to be found in the executive branch. So which regulators would you find at the state level rather than at the federal level? And I will circle this box here. That's kind of a circle, isn't it? I'm not terribly skillful with this pen. But what kinds of regulators do you find in that box, the executive branch at the state level? Some of the most important and expensive functions of state government involve healthcare. They tend to be providers of health care for a number of people who are not faring so well on the private market. Major chunks of state budgets go toward mental health care and other forms of health care. They are very much involved in partnership with the federal government in administering Medicare and Medicaid programs. So health care is one major area for state regulators. Transportation is another area. Lots of state money goes into roads. That's why we have federal highways and state highways. And even with the state highways, or even with the federal highways, state government officials are very much in partnership there to maintain them and to locate them as they're being built and so forth. So healthcare, transportation, education would be a third big ticket item for state government and for state regulators, although a lot of the on-the-ground choices are made at the local level, as we'll see in a minute. Fourth big area in budget terms would be corrections. Much of our criminal justice operates through state budgets and state entities. The police tend to be local government officials, but the prosecutors, the judges, all the biggest prisons are funded Other important governmental regulatory functions happen at the local level of government. That could either be a city government or a county government. So run in the executive branch either by a mayor of a city, or maybe the county manager would be the chief executive at the county level. And these local governments have their own local agencies. Some of the most prominent are the county health department. Local boards of education also make very important choices for the public schools that operate within that local jurisdiction. Notice that there are no, typically anyway these days, there are no truly local courts. There are some exceptions to that, but the trend over time has been away from local courts and shifting those local courts up into funding and control at the state level. And let me close with this observation. We have three rows on our chart here, but you could think of it having a fourth row. Perhaps it's placed on top of the existing three, and that row would be for international institutions, particularly those connected with the United Nations, but a whole collection of those. Those really aren't our topic. We're speaking here about what a lawyer would call domestic regulation, that is, regulation within the country. But that being said, given the interconnectivity of regulations in different countries, it is worth keeping your eye on what regulators in other countries do. It's just that that's a topic for a different presentation or a different course of study. But I want to remind you that international institutions and the parallel national institutions of other nations are out there making their own impact on regulatory questions.